Hi, and welcome to Type Talk with your host, Jonah Dempsey. I just wanted to do a short stream today where I wanted to talk about the so-called missing animal in objective personality. And I wanted to reply to a video by Evelyn Santos where she says we should perhaps call it the last animal. And she gives her rationale for why the term missing is not quite accurate and may even be deleterious, because people might feel like they can't do it, or they might feel like it's impossible, or something like that. And I'm going to make a counter argument that missing is totally fine, although we could also call it the inferior animal. But I don't think there's any reason to, I disagree with Cash Santos when she says that. Well, so basically, she likens it to the left hand, and I would say the left hand is more like the tertiary function. And it's funny because she talks about the tailbone. She says, well, I have a missing tail. I can't strengthen my tail. There's still a tailbone, right? But I can't strengthen my tail because it's missing. Well, I don't know if she's aware of this, but the metaphor of the head being like the dominant function, the right hand the auxiliary, the left hand the tertiary, and the tailbone the inferior function has been around for a really long time. John Beebe uses this when he talks about the head and the tailbone and the spine as the dominant and inferior functions. So I don't know if she's aware of this, but she's actually using a metaphor that has a long history in personality typology. And essentially the point is that the inferior function is not your left hand. The inferior function is your tail. And I'm going to actually be reading from this book. I'll be reading from von Franz's lectures on the inferior function from Lectures on Jungian Typology, 1970. Real seminal work on Jungian type theory. And I'm going to be reading from this just because I'm going to talk about the inferior function. I believe there is a parallel between the inferior function and the so-called inferior animal or missing animal. And I'm fine with using whatever words we want to use. If we don't want missing, what I'm not fine with is the idea that you can strengthen the last animal to the point that it is integrated. And it's the same reason that I think there's a fantasy of strengthening the inferior function as well. And as von Franz says, you can't bring it up to you, you must go down to it. It is the part of us that is eternally, permanently a problem, and that is humbling. And it humbles us. And it wouldn't be humbling if you could just make it stronger. You can't make it stronger. You can make yourself weaker, and then you'll be more in touch with it. So this is the whole thing about the inferior function, which I think there's a parallel with the fourth animal in the objective personality system. And I think that there's a lot of self-help material out there in personality typology where it's all about improving yourself and being a better person and being a stronger, more capable, more successful, happier person. And a lot of this has the fantasy that everything can be improved. And the inferior function is what cannot be improved. And so if you want to talk about improvement, the only improvement that you get is humbling yourself to it, not making it better. And there's this real, particularly Western, but I would just say there's a, I mean, I don't want to assign it to any culture, but there's a bias that it's almost like a privileging of the ego, a kind of narcissistic privileging of agency and of the ability to improve anything if you set your mind to it. And it's like this kind of might makes right attitude that the ego is going to dominate the inferior function and it's going to improve the inferior function and get it in shape, right? It's going to be like, I'm going to get you in shape. I can't stand you being inferior. We're going to make you better. And that's what I hear in Cash Santos when she's saying, she's basically saying, let's not call the objective personality fourth slot animal the missing animal because you can improve it. And if you call it missing, it kind of implies that you can't make it any better. Well, that's exactly what it implies, and that's exactly correct. You can't. That's what I want to get at. You can go into it, but if you go into it, you're going to be going into a undifferentiated, maladapted, maladjusted way of being, and it's actually really hard to go into it, and really scary to go into it. We almost need like safe spaces to be able to go into the inferior function or to be able to go into the fourth slot animal through things like ritual or temporary autonomous zones where you can act out in these ways, because it's not adjusted, it's not adapted, it's not, So I'm going to read what von Franz has to say about it. This is in the first chapter in her lectures on Jung's typology, a general characterization of the inferior function. Let me see a good place to start. Okay, so she's talking about the development of the functions. And how, let me find a good, how the superior function, okay, I'll just start back here. In examining the dynamic interplay between the functions, one must always recognize the hold which the superior function has on the inferior. When someone tries to meet his inferior function and experiences emotional shock or pain in confronting its real reactions, then the superior function at once says, "Ah, that is something. Now we must organize that." The superior function, like an eagle seizing a mouse, tries to get hold of the inferior function and bring it over into the realm of the main function. I know a natural scientist, a very successful introverted thinking type, who in his 50s became very bored with his professional work and began roaming about looking for other possibilities. His wife and family could have told him a lot about his inferior feeling, a field for experimentation right under his nose. He had several dreams of collecting rare mountain flowers, which clearly showed what the unconscious was now aiming at. He had the typical inferior feeling of the thinking type, namely rare and very special feeling. The flowers in the mountains have a much more intense color than those of the plains, and this is also typical for the inferior feeling of the thinking type. He thought he had a good idea for a hobby, so he made friends with a botanist and went off for days, all through his holidays, collecting mountain flowers. Any attempts made by other people at telling him that he could do something about his feeling function only met with the reply that he had given up his main function and was doing something with his other side. He was studying mountain flowers. Thus he got stuck in a concretistic interpretation instead of taking the dream symbolically. And he made a sort of science of it. He wanted knowledge of those flowers, so the main function was added again, and the inferior function once more was frustrated. She's talking here about how difficult it is to actually get into it. And how the dominant function is always going to try to, if you are an extroverted intuitive, like Cash Santos is an extroverted intuitive with inferior SI, then as soon as you actually start to experience that inferior SI, you're suddenly going to this like an eagle seizing the mouse. That extroverted intuition is going to go, aha, and I can use it for this possibility and for this possibility, and this means that I can do it in this way and in that way. It's going to think about it as an improvement. It's going to think about it in terms of how to improve my life, how to become better, how to achieve more mastery. And that's what needs to happen. There needs to be some kind of subjective destitution experience where the dominant function is actually humbled before the inferior. And this is the same with the animals. Cash Santos is lead play, and she's talking about the missing animal, the fourth slot animal of sleep. And she's saying, hey, I don't have missing sleep. Sleep is like my left hand. That's what she's saying, right? And I'm saying, no, you have missing sleep. Your sleep is, if you prefer the term inferior, that's fine. But the fact is, as soon as you actually go into sleep, that dominant play is going to try to take the treasures from the sleep and apply that to opening up the realm for more possibilities and so on. It's like pillaging or plundering. It's trying to use that for its own purposes. And that's not individuation. Jungian individuation means you actually give up the treasures of the lead function, or in this case, the lead animal, in order to descend into that inferiority and fully experience it as inferior. You're not making it any better. You're not improving it. You're not using it as a tool, to improve your purposes of your lead animal or your lead function. You're actually doing the opposite. You're giving up that purpose that you've held so tightly to, and you're experiencing the inferior as inferior. Now, maybe missing is the wrong word. I don't want to argue over what's the right word for it, but inferior animal does seem accurate. So back to the inferior function. To take an irrational type, there's the intuitive who gets into a situation where he should use his inferior sensation. He becomes attracted by the idea of stone cutting or working with clay. This sort of thing very often helps inferior sensation come up in intuitives, for by such means they get in touch with outer purpose or reason, with some kind of concrete material, with matter. He will perhaps mold something in clay, say a very helpless-looking childish statue of an animal. Then he experiences something improving in himself. But immediately, like an eagle, intuition pounces on it and says, this is it. That's what should be introduced into all the schools. And away he goes into his intuition again, into all the possibilities of clay molding, what could be done with it in the education of humanity, what it would include, and how it is the key to the experience of the Godhead. The intuitive always brings in the whole world. But the one thing that is not considered is the molding of another figure. The main function is raving again. Having had this quickening and vivifying touch with the earth, off it goes up into the air again. The same thing happens with the feeling type, who, when cornered by absolute necessity, sometimes produces a few thoughts. Then he quickly escapes this hot bath and never returns to it. But he has a feeling judgment about what thinking is like, and the uses it has, and so on. He makes a number of evaluations instead of continuing the process. In this way, the superior function tries to get hold of the inferior function and organize it. So this is really key, and this is absolutely true with the animals as well. I'm lead sleep, and I have missing play, so I'm the exact opposite of Cash Santos. And with my lead sleep, it's the same thing. My lead sleep is always forecasting and digesting and predicting and formulating and trying to understand and basically crafting worldviews and trying on different perspectives and narrowing down and isolating what I think is the correct objective view of metaphysical reality. I'm a lead sleep INTJ, so introverted intuition is much more concerned with the the one objective truth. It can be kind of a control freak about what the objective truth of reality is. Cash Santos is an ENFP lead play, so we're very opposite in that way, in that she's not concerned with the one single objective truth, but rather on multiple possibilities and opportunities and so on. Now, it's interesting. So for me, my problem is going to be the exact opposite. It's not that I'm unwilling to do play for its own sake. I'm too willing to do that. Or I'm too willing to... I won't do it for its own sake. I'll do it for the sake of sleep, meaning that, if you know what play is exploring different possibilities and interacting and collaborating and kind of like provoking and experimenting in the world and so on. And so what I'll do is I'll do all that, but then again, like the eagle grabbing the mouse, my sleep will come in and it'll draw a whole bunch of conclusions. And it'll try to update my worldview to accurately reflect the new information that I've gained through play. But the focus isn't on staying with the process of play. I'm not actually staying with the process of seeing what happens if I continue to experiment and continue to gather information and continue to interact with other people closely the way that play does. So with my fourth slot or inferior play, I'll dip my toes into that hot bath, but then I run out of, and I immediately go back to sleep and I draw all my conclusions in my introspective sleep space. For Cash Santos, it's the opposite. She will go into that conclusion space where she's trying to actually ask herself the way she objectively sees reality, but then she'll jump back out into play where she wants to collaborate and work with a bunch of other people and engage with a bunch of other material and refusing to be alone with herself. And part of that, here's my main point, is that a big part of that is the desire to make that inferior animal or inferior function better. You have to not desire to make it better. You actually have to desire to make what you're good at worse. So I have to become someone who's really bad at digesting and processing information if I want to actually experience play. Because as long as I'm someone who's really good at those things, I'm going to stay in sleep. I hope I'm not, losing people who are watching here. If you have some familiarity with objective personality, you'll know that the process of sleep, which in my case is NI with FI working together, is a process of digestion, rumination, reflection, kind of an internal space, right? It's something that I'm really good at that just comes naturally to me. I'm always digesting, I'm always reflecting, I'm always processing. Anything that happens in my life, I ruminate on it, and I really process it and digest it. And, I can chastise myself for not being better at play, which is this kind of spontaneous, provocative interaction with other people and experimentation and gathering information and collaborative learning and all this stuff. But I'm really bad at those things. And the impulse is to say, Jonah, you should be better at play. Why don't you make play better? Why don't you improve that? Why don't you practice it? Why don't you work on that? And what I'm saying is, it's actually the opposite. I need to become worse at sleep. I need to not care about processing and digesting stuff as much. I need to not care about ruminating and thinking about things. I need to actually cancel out my leading function, which means going down into this inferior part and experiencing that inferior part as inferior, as impossible to ever get better. And that's okay. It's not supposed to get better. You're supposed to not have so much distance from it. And interestingly, I think this is actually a second half of life thing. I think that trying to do this too early in life is kind of morbid. If you're trying to really integrate the inferior function or go down to it and get in touch with it before you've actually differentiated fully from it with your leading function, it causes problems. So I'm going to read a little more from von Franz. There's, okay, another aspect of the dynamic interplay of the functions is the way in which the inferior function intrudes into the superior and falsifies it. There was a marvelous demonstration of this some time ago in the case of a certain Professor K, who made an attack on the psychology of the unconscious in the Neuzerker Zeitung. He was a pupil of Heidegger in an absolute demonstration of overworked, introverted thinking. This was the unfortunate effect of his being unable to assert anything more than that life is an ontological phenomenon of existence. He enriches his statement with a few more impressive adjectives, but that is what it amounts to. This guy, Professor K, had a single thought. Existence really exists. This one thought expresses a divine plenitude for him, as it also did for Parmenides. He cannot cease reassuring us about such existence. Then he says, but the unconscious would be an uncanny theater of marionettes and ghosts. There you have an excellent illustration of what Jung means when he says the unconscious fantasy becomes proportionately enriched by a multitude of archaically formed facts, a veritable pandemonium of magical factors. That is exactly what Professor K expounds in his article. The idea of the unconscious is awful. It is just a theatrical pandemonium. And then he saves his conscious position by asserting that it simply doesn't exist. It is just the invention of the psychologists. If you overdo one of the conscious attitudes, it becomes poor and loses its fertility. Also, the unconscious counterfunction, the opposite function, encroaches upon the main function and falsifies it. That is obvious in Professor K's article. It shows that his feeling is really concerned with enlightening mankind as to the absurdity of the idea of the psychology of the unconscious. He entirely loses the objective style to which we are accustomed in scientific discussion, and feels himself to be a prophet whose mission it is to save mankind from some evil poison. His whole moral or feeling function came up and contaminated his thinking. His thinking became subjective instead of objective, and it was obvious that he had not read the literature on the psychology of the unconscious. Okay, so here it's a pretty obvious parallel with the animals. If you're overdoing your dominant animal so much, then your inferior animal comes up and contaminates it. So for me, I'm lead sleep, and if I'm overdoing sleep so much, that's my NIFI. That's like the NIFI loop, the classic NIFI loop they talk about for INTJs. Then my sleep, which is TE and SE, that's going to seep in with a vengeance. And I'm going to be provoking people unnecessarily, unconsciously, right? And actually, my ability to reflect using sleep will be trivialized. So I will end up falsifying my dominant function anyway, my dominant animal. Another way in which the inferior function often intrudes upon the superior can be shown in the case of a very down-to-earth, realistic, introverted sensation type. Sensation types, whether introverted or extroverted, are generally quite good in their relationship to money, in not being too extravagant. But if such a type overdoes this, his inferior intuition becomes involved. I knew a sensation type who became madly stingy and could practically not move about in life any longer because, well, in Switzerland, everything costs something. When one tried to find out where this sudden stinginess originated, hitherto he had been just moderately stingy, like most people here, one noticed that he produced any number of dark possibilities in life. He might have an accident and be unable to work and support his family. Something might happen to his family. His wife might have a long illness. His son might fail in his studies and need more years than usual. His mother-in-law, a very rich woman, might suddenly get furious with him and leave her money to another family instead of to his, etc. Those are instances of the dark fears of what might happen. This is typical of negative inferior intuition. Only the dark possibilities are envisaged. The first appearances of his inferior intuition reinforced his sensation in the wrong way by making him stingy. Life no longer flowed because everything was falsified by the invasion of inferior intuition. So here's what we need to be careful of, is that, same with the animals, when your leading animal, is so strong, and then and it keeps trying to dominate the missing animal or the fourth slot animal, and it keeps trying to improve the fourth slot animal for its own purposes, life no longer flows because there's an ebb and a flow, and the dominant function has to let up. The dominant animal has to let up, and it has to allow that inferiority to be inferior. There's something great about that, about how Jung, himself a dominant introverted intuitive, was able to go into, at Bollingen, he was able to use his inferior sensation in order to make things out of clay and to sculpt and carve and to build this house and so on. And that's really important to be able to do that, no matter how bad it is, just to let that inferior function be bad and to still do it, despite the fact it's bad. When the time comes for the development of the other functions, there are generally two associated phenomena. The superior function degenerates, like an old car which begins to run down and get worn out, and the ego becomes bored with it because everything you can do too well becomes boring. Then, the inferior function, instead of appearing in its own field, tends to invade the main function, giving it an unadapted neurotic twist. You are thus confronted with a neurotic mixtum compositum, a thinking type who can't think any longer, or a feeling type who doesn't show any agreeable feeling anymore. There's a transitional stage where people are neither fish nor flesh, nor good red herring. Formerly, they were good thinkers, but they can't think anymore and have not yet reached a new level. It is therefore very important to know one's type and recognize what the unconscious is up to now, for otherwise one is caught from behind. So this is a great point, too, that it's the same for the animals, where periodically you will be unable to do your lead animal because you're in this transitional phase, and it's important to realize that, you might actually a phase of developmental growth, of individuation, may include what appears to be a degeneration of the ability to function normally with the breakdown of the outmoded previous ways of functioning. One of the great difficulties in defining one's own or another's type occurs when people have already reached the stage of being bored with their main function and their main attitude. They very often assure you with absolute sincerity that they belong to the type opposite from what they really are. The extrovert swears that he is deeply introverted, and vice versa. This comes from the fact that the inferior function subjectively feels itself to be the real one. It feels itself the more important, more genuine attitude. So a thinking type, because he knows that everything in his life matters from the feeling aspect, will assure you that he is a feeling type. It does no good, therefore, to think of what matters most when trying to discover one's type. Rather ask, what do I habitually do most? An extrovert can be constantly extroverting, but will assure you and will mean it that he is deeply introverted and only concerned with the inner thing. That is not a swindle, it's how he feels. For he knows that though it may be only a minute a day, that minute when he introverts is the real thing. There he is close to himself, there he is real. In the realm of the inferior function, too, one is overwhelmed, one is unhappy, one has one's great problem, one is constantly impressed by things. And therefore, in a way, the intensity of life is very often much greater there, especially if the superior function is already worn out. Practically, it is most helpful when one wants to find out the type to ask. It's most helpful when one wants to find out the type to ask, what is the greatest cross for the person? Where is his greatest suffering? Where does he feel that he always knocks his head against the obstacle and suffers hell? That generally points to the inferior function. Many people, moreover, develop two superior functions so well that it is very difficult to say whether the person is a thinking intuitive type or an intuitive type with good thinking, for the two seem equally good. Sometimes sensation and feeling are so well developed in an individual that you would have difficulty in ascertaining which is the first. But does the intuitive thinking person suffer more from knocking his head on sensation facts or from feeling problems? Here you can decide which is the first and which the well-developed second function. I shall turn now to a general consideration of the problem of assimilating the inferior function. Consciousness evolves in early childhood from the unconscious. From our point of view, the unconscious is a primary and consciousness a secondary fact. Therefore, the unconscious totality and the structure of the total personality exist in time before the conscious personality and could be looked at in this way. A fourfold structure in the field of consciousness with the ego as center. The preconscious total quaternion structure of the possibility or personality is below. So basically, what von Franz is saying, this is a distinction, one leading interpretation of Freud, which has fallen into some disrepute since Lacan and since kind of more neo-Freudians, but one interpretation of Freud is that the conscious ego is primary and that the unconscious is the rejected, repressed remainder. That the consciousness, the conscious ego is developing and forming, and as it forms, it begins to differentiate and say, this is not me, that's not me, and to actually omit from consciousness certain psychic contents which are too difficult for it to admit. Like it wants to reject, it's trying to be good, for instance, so it wants to reject bad qualities of itself and others, or it wants to believe the other person is good, so it doesn't want to see the bad qualities of them, and so it represses all this stuff. And so one of the traditional interpretations of the Freudian model of consciousness is that the unconscious is secondary to the ego development. That the ego is developing, and as it develops, it creates the unconscious through the act of repression, through casting out of consciousness, or even things that never were conscious in the first place, that it won't admit in. So for Jung, this is reversed. And I'm not saying that all Freudian interpretations will be that way. I think the more Lacanian Freudian interpretations, and even some non-Lacanian ones, sometimes do see the unconscious as primary and see consciousness as individuating from the unconscious. However, Jung makes this explicit, and von Franz here makes it very explicit. From our point of view, the unconscious is a primary and consciousness a secondary fact. Therefore, the unconscious totality and the structure of total personality exist in time before the conscious personality. So von Franz is here saying that, that this orientation happens and then consciousness emerges from that. When the functions develop in the field of consciousness, A, B, C, D, there comes up from below first, let us say, the thinking function, which then becomes one of the main functions of the ego. She's referring again to this picture with A, B, C, D, and she's saying that, it's coming up into consciousness, that the thinking function is coming up into consciousness first, for instance, for a thinking dominant type. The ego then uses mainly the operation of thinking in the organization of its field of consciousness. Slowly another function appears, and gradually they all, under favorable conditions, appear in the field of consciousness. When the fourth function comes up, however, the whole upper structure collapses. The more you pull up the fourth, the further the upper floor descends. And this is why I'm talking about this with the animals as well, because again, this all started because Evelyn Cash Santos is talking about pulling up the fourth animal, the fourth slot animal, into consciousness, and talking about improving it, and saying, we shouldn't call it a missing animal because our tail is missing. We should think of it more like a left hand. You can still use your left hand. You can get really good at using your left hand. You can improve your usage of your left hand. And I'm saying, no, the missing animal is like the inferior function. It's that fourth slot animal. It's just like the fourth slot function. You cannot pull it up into consciousness. It is like the missing tail. It's not like the left hand. The left hand's like the third slot, right? It's this missing animal or inferior animal or fourth slot animal. You can't pull it up. It's just like what von Franz is saying here. When the fourth function comes up, the whole upper structure collapses. The more you pull up the fourth, the further the upper floor descends. A mistake some people make is that they think they can pull up the inferior function onto the level of the other conscious functions. I can only say, well, if you wish to do so, try. But you can try forever. It is absolutely impossible to pull up. Like a fisherman with his rod, the inferior function, and all such attempts as, for instance, speeding it up, or educating it to come up at the right moment, prove failures. One can try to force it to function in an exam or in certain situations in life, but this succeeds only to a certain extent and only by bringing in conventional, borrowed material. One cannot bring up the fourth function, for it insists on remaining below. It is contaminated with the unconscious and remains in that condition. Trying to fish it up would be like trying to bring up the whole collective unconscious, which is something one just cannot do. The fish will be too big for the rod. So what does one do? cut it off again, this is regression. But if you don't give in, there is only the other alternative. The fish will pull you into the water. At this moment comes the great conflict, which means for the thinking type, for instance, the famous sacrificium intellectus, or for the feeling type, the sacrificium of his feeling, the sacrifice of intellect, the sacrifice of feeling. At the point that you actually have a conflict with your inferior animal or inferior function, you have to choose to give up what you're really good at. You have to sacrifice it. For me to actually go into play, I have to sacrifice sleep. And I have to stop being so reflective and stop ruminating. And I have to allow things to happen without, experiencing them in my mind as like a ruminative process. And for Evelyn Cash Santos, if she wants to really work on her sleep, although even the idea of working on something is such the wrong metaphor here, but if she wants to individuate, we can say, it will involve giving up her play, giving up her ability to keep multiple possibilities open, giving up her ability to suss out the patterns and all the different things that her NE and TE do, and she's going to have to go into her SI and her FI. And to really experience that inferiority without having the dominant function or the dominant animal there. It's like how John Beebe, himself a lead extrovert intuitive in ENTP, talked about how he basically was always interpreting and always working within the world of meaning with his clients. He was a psychoanalyst, and he would see all these clients, and he would always be saying, what does this mean? What does this mean? What are the interpretations? That's using his dominant function, and probably his dominant animal too, his lead extroverted intuition. And what he said was, when he actually slowed down and gave up the ability to interpret, what he noticed was his own body using his SI, his inferior introverted sensing, that the other person could be talking to him and that he would start to get physical innervations. He would feel physically symptoms based on them talking to him and feel located within his body certain SI sort of feelings, which he was then able to use that information to help the other person. So that's one example. Now, of course, he was probably still using his extrovert intuition like an eagle to snatch up the data from the inferior sensing and then, see what he could do with it, which is very NE, because NE is an action function. But that's what I'm saying. If you really want to enter into this conflict, if you're an extrovert intuitive, you have a bias towards action, and you have to give up your nose for opportunity. You have to give up your ability to keep multiple possibilities going. You have to give up, you have to basically allow yourself to be in a dead-end situation with no exit and not take any action. And that's really hard to do, the same way that the thinking type has to do the sacrificium intellectus, the feeling type, the sacrificium of feeling. Von Franz. It is having the humility to go down with one's other functions onto that lower level. This then produces a stage between the two layers at about the level where everything is neither thinking, nor feeling, nor sensation, nor intuition. Something new comes up, namely a completely different and new attitude towards life in which one uses all and none of the functions all the time. Very often someone will naively say that he is a thinking type and is now going to develop his feeling function. What an illusion! If a person is a thinking type, he can first go either to sensation or to intuition. That is his choice. Then he moves to the opposite of the two secondary functions, and lastly to the inferior one. But he cannot cross directly to the opposite function. The reason is very simple. It is that they exclude each other completely. They are incompatibles. Take the example of a staff officer who has to plan the evacuation of a town population in the best possible way under given conditions. Unfortunately, his own wife and children are in the same town. If he gives in to his own feelings about them, he won't develop a good plan. He just cannot. He must simply obliterate them from his mind and tell himself that it is now his job to plan the evacuation as well as he can. He must think of his own feelings as mere sentimentality. This is a depreciation in order to free himself. One cannot make a straight jump from one function to its opposite, but one can assimilate thinking with sensation or have them function together. it is possible to combine the other two auxiliary functions very easily, so that in the jump from one to the other, one will not suffer as much as if he had to jump to the opposite function. When one has to move from intuition to sensation, one can still use the thinking function as a judge. When intuition and sensation fight, he can detach himself from the fight by thinking. So this is another interesting point that we should also apply to the animals. I have lead sleep and I have missing play. So what this is saying is that my blast and my consume can help. I can't go directly from sleep to play, but I can be in my rumination of sleep, then I can blast, which is thinking out loud. And I can consume, which is observing and understanding, or gathering. And from there, if I'm able to kind of descend into that, then I might be able to enter into play. But these animals are attentional modes, and to actually go into them, this is me speaking now, as a side point, involves something like a mild trance state. I'm in blast right now, and if I wanted to actually go into consume, I'd have to slow down and start to look around and see what I notice and things like that. And if I want to go into play, I have to go even to more of a trance state because you have to slow down. It's like when you're watching John Beebe. I highly recommend everyone watch John Beebe, the great Jungian analyst. He has a great YouTube. I'll post it right here. So John Beebe has a really nice one where you can watch him being interviewed. I'm posting him into the chat right there. And what you'll find is that he speaks very slowly. He's actually going into a different attentional mode. He's giving up his quick-witted, extroverted intuition in order to descend through his TI and FE towards his SI. This, incidentally, may be why host Eric Strauss of Talking with Famous People types John Beebe as an INFJ, not as an ENTP, because Eric Strauss is picking up on his FE and on his lack of any. Well, part of it's because he's done that sacrificium. Beebe has done the sacrificium where he's sacrificed some of the quickness of the lead function. If I analyze a thinking type, I never push him into feeling at once. I see that the other functions are first assimilated to a certain extent. It is a mistake to forget this intermediary stage. Take, for instance, a thinking type who falls madly in love with a completely inappropriate person because of his inferior feeling. If he has already developed sensation, which implies a certain sense of reality, and of intuition, the capacity to smell a rat, he will not fall into complete nonsense. But if he is only a one-sided thinking type and he falls in love with an inappropriate female and has no sense of reality and no intuition, there will happen what is so beautifully depicted in the film The Blue Angel, where the school professor becomes a circus clown in the service of a vamp. There are no intermediary fields where he can catch himself. He is just knocked over by his inferior function. But if his analyst could see to it, while he has not yet much feeling, that at least he has developed a certain sense of reality, then he can break the difficulty with that intermediary function. I think that is something to keep in mind if one is an analyst, that one should never jump directly to the inferior function. Of course, life does it. Life does not care. But the analytical process should not go that way, and normally it does not do so if one follows the intimations given in the dreams. The tendency of the process is that the development should follow a serpentine movement. This is the normal way in which the unconscious tries to bring up the inferior function. This is the end of my general outline of the problem of the inferior function. The next step will be to give a short description of what the inferior function of each type looks like in practical life. And there's a question and answer period. And by the way, this is a fantastic book. I highly recommend everybody get this book. There's questions like, is this always normative? Are there situations where functions do not differentiate one-sidedly? To which von Franz says, yes, in certain cultures, people who still live completely in nature, such as peasants and hunters and the Bushmen, of whom Lauren van der Post wrote, would not survive unless they used all the functions. But in that case, they don't have the same specialization. Yeah, it's a really great book. But the reason I was reading about it was because I basically wanted to adapt what von Franz is saying about the inferior function to the inferior animal. So again, if you're following objective personality as a type system and you're interested in it and you're learning about it, and you already know some kind of Jungian work basically, the main thing I want to say is that there's a real pitfall, and that pitfall is thinking that you can improve your fourth slot animal, and thinking that you can just make it better, and you can educate it, and you can control it, and you can make it operate when you want to operate it. And basically, it's actually there for the opposite purpose. It's there to humble you and to encourage you when you enter into conflict with it out of necessity to give up, to sacrifice what you're so good at. The thinking type has to sacrifice the ability to think so well in order to go into feeling. Similarly, if you're lead play, you have to sacrifice your lead play in order to go into sleep. You can't just keep doing the play and then make sleep better. It's just not going to work. And looking at it like, going to the gym and working out or something is not the right metaphor. It's absolutely not. It's much more like the missing tail. That's a much better way to think of it. And this thing that's missing, if you really want to, it's missing in the sense that it's not that it's missing, but it's missing from consciousness. So if you want to find it, here's what I'll say. It's a missing animal because it's not in your field of consciousness. It's not in your field of awareness. And if you want to find it, you have to go into the unconscious. So it's just like the Nekia, the night sea journey, or the subjective destitution experience, whereby somebody descends into the Hadean underworld. All this stuff that they talk about, whether it's the hero's journey or, if you prefer a different myth. There's all these different myths that talk about descending and going through that dark night of the soul experience, going into the unconscious and being humbled by that experience, and then you find that treasure. And so, yeah, the missing animal is missing, but you can find it. You just have to give up everything else and slow down into the unconscious, and then you find it, and it is extremely rewarding to find, but you can only hold on to it insofar as you're willing to be pulled into the water. That was the fishing metaphor. She's like, it's like a fisher person, and it's impossible to pull it up out of the water. So the only other thing, unless you just give up, is to go into the water, to actually descend into the water. And then that is very terrifying and scary, and you're basically allowing yourself to temporarily lose your adaptation and your persona and your way of getting along in the world, and to temporarily become wild, and to become uncivilized, and to become a little bit maladjusted and poorly adapted, and so on. And you're doing this for the purpose of the revivifying effect of close contact with the unconscious. All right, thank you all for watching. This has been Type Talk with Jonah Dempsey. Here's the book again if you're interested. It's Jung's Typology, or the full title is Lectures on Jung's Typology. It contains 2 lecture series, one by Marie-Louise von Franz and one by James Hillman, published in 1970. I think this might be a spring. Yeah, this is a spring publications here. There's different editions. It's a really good book. Highly recommend it. Thanks for watching all.